Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, or good night, however and whenever you may be listening. Thank you for stopping into another fantabulous episode of the Take It Easy podcast, coming to you on a beautiful November 21st, 2019. It's Thursday. I'm glad it's Thursday because by the time we get to Thursday, the sports content finally picks up again. Why? Because football rules the sports talk landscape in America. But we have a lot of basketball to talk about today, and we're also going to end with baseball because no other podcast in America will talk to you about the Atlanta Braves in the middle of November. That's why we are reinventing the podcasting universe. So, I think the first place to start would have to be Ben Simmons, because of what happened last night, a defining moment in the history of the NBA. Ben Simmons made a three-pointer. Ben Simmons finally made a three-pointer. This singular moment right here you can point to, and this is not an overreaction in any way. This singular moment you can point to as the turn of the tides for the Philadelphia 76ers. And sure, I know the Sixers have fallen off since their incredible undefeated start to the season, and I know that the Celtics looked really good last night, and we will talk a lot about them. But I feel I can point to this singular moment and say this is the turn for the Philadelphia 76ers towards championships. Devin Booker may not be available now, and he's the perfect piece to finish off that roster. And honestly, I heard this with my homies over at the 3 and the Key, but honestly, they just look like they miss J.J. Redick right now more than anyone else. Just a go-to scorer. And that's why they need Devin Booker. But Philadelphia, if Ben Simmons can hit some threes, think how many points that's going to add every game. And then Ben Simmons is never going to be a great three-point shooter, but if he can hit a few of them, because he hasn't really shot them this year, then could add a few points a game. And those few points a game could be the difference between winning and losing. Just tell my incredible bet yesterday of the Celtics 5.5. They didn't win, but they covered. So in a way, they did win. There are two huge events I want to talk about. One was last night's Celtics-Clippers game, and the other is Thursday Night Football tonight. So I want to talk about them equally. And just in terms of chronological order, I'm going to start with the NBA game because that one has already been played. So last night's game was the best team in the Eastern Conference versus the second best team in the Western Conference, i.e. Boston and the Clippers. And it was the first game Kawhi and Paul George played together, and neither of them looked like the stars in that game. But dear God, if the Celtics are a really good team. First of all, Kemba Walker is better than Kyrie Irving. We can end that discussion right there. The buck stops right there on that. But I know Paul George scored a lot of points, but dear God, Beverly played out of his mind. Lou Williams, 27 points. Like, if all 5 of those dudes on that team, I'm talking about Kawhi, Paul George, Beverly, Lou Williams, and Trez Harrell, if all of them play to their biggest capabilities, there are no flaws with that team. That team has been perfectly constructed in that sense to where if everyone does what they're supposed to, there is no flaw in that team. Maybe they don't have enough bigs, but even then, Trez Harrell is blocking shots at a higher rate than Blake Griffin ever did. It's scary to think about what that team would look like if all 5 of them are on in one night. And even Kawhi took a back seat last night to the scoring on Lou Will and Paul George a little bit, but Paul George missed a lot of shots as well. And they still wound up winning in overtime against the best team in the league, other than maybe the Lakers. But they've also beaten the Lakers this year without Paul George. So that team, dear God, I don't know. Pray for the league if that team is on, because not only do they have arguably the best tandem in the league, other than maybe the Lakers, if not the best, the second best tandem in the league, they have the deepest team in the league because of the 6th man and 7th man, Lou Will, Trez Harrell, plus Mo Harkless can be a scorer on any given night, and Patrick Beverley is still Patrick Beverley. You love him or hate him, and the little dude is a scrapper, and he put up 16 rebounds last night. Whew. Speaking of, Jason Tatum dropping Paul George on the game-tying 3 in regulation. It's like, whew. That was a move. Shout out to Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown for making these leaps that we thought they were going to make in their second year, but then didn't. I think just a product of the Kyrie situation. Every year is important, but I feel like the Celtics are back on track. They are legitimate contenders, I can say. I mean, if you weren't sold on them before, like, you know, how much of a sample size can you learn from 12 games? Last night convinced me for sure. Or should have convinced anyone who had no doubt. I had no doubt. What I think doesn't ultimately matter. It's just what is fact and what is reality. I was already convinced, but if you weren't convinced before, last night should have been convincing enough in a loss for you to be like, okay, the Celtics are legitimate finals contenders in the East. Speaking of which, that's the next thing I wanted to do as I was falling down a rabbit hole last night, is I created the NBA hierarchy through this part of the season. So I ranked them in terms of these categories for the NBA hierarchy. The finals contenders might be great, still not sure. Off to a hot start, off to a cold start. Mediocre, tanking, shit, but it's not their fault, shit, but it is their fault. So those are our categories for the NBA hierarchy. So those are the order also, since it may not be clear. That's how you rank in order. So being off to a hot start is better than being off to a cold start, but being off to a cold start is better than being mediocre, because we know your team is good, just the record doesn't reflect it in the moment. So finals contenders, all of these have 4 until we get later down into mediocre. Finals contenders: Boston, Los Angeles Clippers, and Philadelphia. Those are your finals contenders as of right now. Boston and the Clippers we've gone in depth about, despite the fact even that Kawhi is not playing anywhere near 100% of his capabilities, because it's the regular season, and the regular season means nothing to Kawhi. The Lakers are the best team in the league. They've reconstructed their roster around LeBron, given him a second star, which obviously it's hard to get those, but the Lakers did it, and then they've built a roster tailored to him. I've talked about it before. Go listen to Tuesday's podcast also if you want deep, in-depth Lakers talk, and for some reason deep, in-depth Oklahoma City talk. And Philadelphia, we talked about them at the beginning. Might be great, still not sure. 4 teams there: Milwaukee, Denver, Houston, Miami. So Milwaukee has been off to a great start by most measures, but by their ridiculous expectations, it is a little bit of a question mark, only because the biggest question marks we had at the start of the season are being exposed. How do they find shooting without Brogdon? Is it just going to be Brook Lopez and Chris Middleton? Do they have another option down the stretch besides Giannis, or is it just Giannis is the only choice? And even then, Giannis still hasn't improved his three-point shot dramatically from last season. In terms of the Nuggets have had their question marks because Mike Malone has called the team out in wins for being not necessarily up to speed. And then Murray and Jokic are their two best players, and they're both in their early to mid-20s, and everyone has to lose before they can win. That was the argument last year for the Nuggets. So maybe they take the big leap, jump up into one of those number one seeds, and who knows, ultimately, where the Nuggets will end up in the ranking. They're still a very big wild card in the whole situation, despite the fact they're winning a lot of their games, but good teams find a way to win games they aren't playing their best in. So going back to Giannis, Giannis is shooting 30% from three this year compared to his 26% last year. He's also taken he's made twice as many three-point shots as he did last year, and he is attempting 50% more, about 60% more than he did last year. So he's gone up to 30%, still not reliable enough for Milwaukee to count on it consistently. Houston, we've talked a lot about their flaws. People are talking about the Harden-Westbrook thing is not working out, yet the record, they just keep winning and winning games. Harden has to do more of what he did last year than he ever has before. This is the Rockets' chance. Like, this might be their last chance, if not their last chance, their second to last chance in the championship window that they opened for themselves a couple years ago. Well, really a few years ago when Harden went to the conference finals against the Warriors, when they came back from down 3-1 against the Clippers, that was kind of the open of the window. They didn't have any expectation that year, so that was kind of like, okay. Then the expectations started mounting. They lose to the Spurs in 2016. In 2016, they lose to the Spurs. 2016 was that crap year that was wasted. They finished like the 8th seed in the West and lost to the Warriors. 2017, they lose to the Spurs. 2018, they lose to the Warriors in that heartbreak Game 7 that they went 0 for whatever. And then last year, probably the second best team, Harden should have won MVP, scores 36 a game, and they lose to the Warriors in the second round just by placating of seeding. So the Rockets' window is slowly closing over the 4 years going down to now. They need to make the most of this season, and Harden is doing everything he can. I think he's averaging 37 points a game, more than he did, or more points per game, 37 than he did last year, 36 and change. And it's really, really crazy to watch. He's doing what Wilt Chamberlain and Michael Jordan did in terms of statistics, in terms of baseline statistics. And Miami, the only question about Miami is that Jimmy Butler is your best player. And not only is Jimmy Butler your best player, but they're coming from a retooled roster with 3 of their 5 best players being first year or second, have never played a full NBA season. If we're talking about Tyler Hero, Kendrick Nunn, and Duncan Robinson, how is that going to look in February, May, April? All right, off to a hot start is the next category. Those teams are Dallas, Toronto, Phoenix, and Utah. I've talked a lot about Phoenix for absolutely no reason on this podcast. Utah, I mentioned briefly about Mike Conley's offense not being there, being their struggle through the first week. That has reversed course a bit. Donovan Mitchell has shown meager improvement, I want to say. Yet I have not looked at Donovan Mitchell statistically this year. Donovan Mitchell averaging more minutes, improved his three-point shooting this season. Defensive numbers are still there, averaging 25 points per game. Donovan Mitchell has slightly improved his numbers from last year. He's improved every year of his career so far, and that makes sense. Like, not every player can be like Luka and just start going for crazy triple-double numbers. It's a slow progression. The only issue is that Utah doesn't have time because their championship window is progressing slowly. Not that they've ever been legitimately contending for a championship. They've never been in that first tier of legit finals contenders. But Utah does need to show a little bit more. Honestly, Utah fits into this category because they don't fit into any of the other ones. But they have been off to a great start this season, and I do like what I've seen from them. Toronto, despite losing Kawhi, has come back 10-4 on the season. Spicy P looks like a legitimate superstar in the Eastern Conference. Even Lowry's been down and out a bit. Powell and Van Fleet are both stepping into bigger roles this year with the losses of both Lowry being injured, Kawhi's scoring, and Danny Green's departure. We don't focus on Danny Green as much, but Toronto has needed some of that help from those players, and Van Fleet and Powell have stepped up in that way. Marc Gasol is still there doing Marc Gasol things, basically like a third superstar at this point of his career. And Dallas, Luka Doncic has just carried them to a lot of wins this year. They're the fourth best team in the West, and I don't see any way that they could fit into that finals contenders or the might be great category because I just haven't seen enough from them. And also, situation with Denver last year, everyone's got to lose before they can win. So no matter how good Dallas is, I don't expect them to hold up against a Lakers, a Clippers, a Houston, a team with deep playoff experience. The same way the Nuggets took the Spurs to 7 games last year and then petered out against Portland. And that was Portland. If you're talking about a team, I know the Lakers haven't had playoff experience, but LeBron has had a bleep ton of playoff experience in his career. LeBron went straight to the finals with Cleveland, and we just attributed that to LeBron. So he's a different case. Off to a cold start. These teams are Brooklyn, Orlando, Portland, and San Antonio. These are the teams that we're pretty sure are good, but they've had rough starts to their season. Orlando has turned that around. Theirs was atrocious to start the season, but Orlando has bounced back quite nicely. Brooklyn looks like discount Celtics from last year, and Kyrie has to do everything for that team, which is not the way the team was constructed last year. They got to the 6th seed. It was built on Joe Harris giving you a big night. It was built on Caris LeVert's big shots. It was built on D'Angelo Russell being the star but not being the focal point of the offense. You've changed all that now with the entrance of Kyrie Irving, and they don't have Kevin Durant to counterbalance him. I don't know how this turns around for Brooklyn. It might just be that they're simply talented enough to win games and improve their record in playoff seeding, despite the fact that they haven't been winning at a high clip thus far. Portland and San Antonio have been awful this year, but we know San Antonio is on the decline, just basically considering you look at all the duos in the NBA, Luka and Kristaps, LeBron and AD, Giannis and Middleton, Simmons and Embiid, and theirs is DeRozan and Aldridge. You can just play it that way and like, okay, they're like the 7th best duo in the Western Conference. Maybe 6th if you take out Utah. If you like DeRozan more than Utah. DeRozan has been linked to a lot of trade rumors recently. I don't know whether I buy that or not, but he can be a free agent at the end of this season, and I don't know how in love he is with San Antonio, but I also know most players would be in love with $27 million as well. Portland tried to combat their cold start by signing Melo. Good luck. I told you should have just traded for AD. Their GM got a 5-year extension, and by the time those 5 years are up, Lillard and McCollum are still going to be his stars. Mediocre. Okay, so these ones are the longest list. The mediocre teams are Detroit, Atlanta, Charlotte, Indiana, Minnesota, Oklahoma City, New Orleans, and Sacramento. Now, 4 of those teams are with a caveat. Detroit has one of the 15 arguably best players in the league, 15 to 20 best players in the league, unlike any of these other teams. Indiana does not have their star in Oladipo. Minnesota has been off to a great start this season. I just don't believe in them at all, and they've proven me right over the last few weeks. I think they've gone like 2-4 in their last 6 games. It's like they were in the hot start category a while ago, and now they're back to mediocre. And New Orleans is not tanking. They're just very young and still finding a way to win games. So the rest of those teams are just mediocre. Tanking. 4 teams that are very exclusively in the tanking category, whether they know it or not, and only one of them doesn't know it. Washington, Cleveland, Memphis, and Chicago. Which team do you think knows they are not in the tanking, or doesn't know they're in the tanking window? That would be Washington, even though they need to admit that they're in the tanking category because their entire roster consists of Bradley Beal, Ish Smith, and a bunch of former Lakers second-round picks. So they are tanking despite what the organization wants to believe. Just trade Bradley Beal to Miami. You can get Justice Winslow and a bleep ton of draft picks. I know they're holding out for one of those 3 good pieces like Nunn, Hero, and Robinson. I know you're holding out for them, but I don't think they're coming. So ultimately, Beal getting an extension does you no good now, especially if you compare the John Wall contract off your books. I know that some people don't like cheapness that way, but I don't think there's anything John Wall can bring to that organization anymore. And when he gets back, they're going to be in full-scale tanking. So are they just hoping he brings value for 5 years down the road? Like, there's no point in holding on to this anymore, but he won't be back until at the earliest beginning of the 2020 season. Feels like so long since we've seen John Wall. Okay, the last category, shit, but it is not their fault. That would be the Golden State Warriors. Yeah, they're shit, but it's not their fault. And then shit, but it is their fault. That is the New York Knicks. What'd you expect, New York? You dig this to yourself, you pieces of bleep. That is the NBA hierarchy. Yes! Now we get to talk about football, and not specifically football, Thursday night football. And it's strange because after such a slow week and I care so much about this Thursday night football game, I should have just talked about it on Tuesday and Wednesday to hype it up. After all that, it ends up being like the 4th thing we talk about after Ben Simmons and the NBA hierarchy and Celtics Clippers, but that's the way the podcast works sometimes. You don't have content for a Tuesday, Wednesday, and then bam, Thursday hits you, you got a 40-minute podcast. So I talked about when I did the Football Monday recap that Deshaun Watson has never experienced a loss this great in his career. And on a short week, how is he going to respond to this? Like, legitimate questions about his team. His MVP candidacy just has holes everywhere, simply because Lamar Jackson poked